The year is 1945. Europe is burning and the Reich is crumbling. But even as the Allies close in from both east and west, the war is far from over. In the heart of Hungary, the city of Budapest is under siege. Soviet forces have encircled it, determined to crush all resistance. But Hitler will not allow the city to fall without a fight. From the cold forests of Poland to the plains of Ukraine, elite German divisions are pulled into a desperate gamble, one final counterattack. One so surprising that the Soviets were worried this might have been a massive Eastern Front breakthrough. Among them are the battle-hardened veterans of the Waffen-SS, the Wiking and Totenkopf divisions. These men have survived 5 brutal years of war, and now they are thrown into one of the last major offensives of the Eastern Front, Operation Conrad. Outnumbered, undermanned, surrounded by overwhelming Soviet strength, what follows is a savage clash of armour and infantry fought through frozen hills and shattered villages. German forces, against all odds, strike blow after blow, achieving stunning tactical victories. But time is against them, and every success comes at a brutal cost. This is Operation Conrad, a forgotten campaign of sacrifice, fury, and the dying breath of the last German war machine. Despite many post-war accounts suggesting otherwise, Operation Conrad did not begin on January 1st, 1945. It actually started the day before, when Corps Group Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps launched a diversionary attack towards the village of Osi, located just 8 kilometers southeast of the crucial crossroads town of Waffen-SS, had already seen heavy fighting since December 29th. There, General Major Thunert's 1st Panzer Division and the Hungarian 20th Infantry Division had been locked in battle with the Soviet 21st Guards Rifle Corps for control of the area. Holding Osi was vital as it protected the large oil refinery at Pétfürdő, located only 6 kilometers to the west, which remarkably continued producing fuel despite the nearby fighting. The first attack on Osi by an armoured battle group from the 1st Panzer Division began at 3 p.m. on December 31st. Despite the support of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, with 100 sorties flown by FW-190 fighter bombers of the Hungarian 1st Squadron and the famous Stuka dive bombers of Colonel Rudel's Schlachtgeschwader II, the assault failed. Thunert's men lost 6 tanks and assault guns out of 55 vehicles and managed to destroy only 4 Soviet Su-76 assault guns while inflicting around 200 casualties on the 69th Guards Rifle Division. Later that evening, Thunert launched a second, stronger attack. This force included Kampfgruppe Elias from Panzer Regiment 1 with over 36 tanks and assault guns, Kampfgruppe Huppert from Panzer Grenadier Regiment 113, artillery from the 1st Battalion of Panzer Artillery Regiment 73, and 5 Hetzer tank destroyers from the SS Cavalry Squadron Sparwasser. After a brief 10-minute artillery bombardment that rang in the new year, the assault began at 11:45 p.m. After hard fighting, they finally captured Osi by 4:30 a.m. on January 1st. More German casualties came from landmines than from enemy fire, forcing combat engineers to clear paths under cover of darkness. After securing Osi, the armour, except for the Hetzers, withdrew to Waffen-SS, while the Panzer Grenadiers, including SS troops under Untersturmführer Heinrich Sparwasser, occupied the town and the vineyard-covered hills to the south. There, they braced for the inevitable Soviet counterattack. Soon after the German tanks pulled back, 2 regiments of the 69th Guards Rifle Division launched a fierce counterattack, retaking Osi after heavy fighting and advancing toward Pétfürdő. However, the Soviets were repelled before reaching the refinery or the main German defense line at Berida. Although they lost Osi, the Germans managed to hold the vital high ground south of the town, digging into the vineyards to repel further assaults. Though the attacks on December 31st and January 1st fell short of complete success, they achieved their main objective, distracting Soviet General Zakharov of the 4th Guards Army. Zakharov's headquarters, just 30 kilometers away in Stuhlweisenberg, shifted focus to this sector, temporarily easing pressure elsewhere. Thanks to these efforts, the front line was pushed a few kilometers further from the vital oil refinery, which continued operations. Meanwhile, 25 kilometers northwest of Stuhlweisenberg, Lieutenant General Gorshkov's 5th Guards Cavalry Corps continued its push to seize the town of More. More controlled access through the Sarvis River Valley and the Bicske Forest, offering a path to the open plains leading to the Danube Valley. Had Gorshkov succeeded, he could have outflanked Gilla's upcoming offensive before it even began. On January 1st, despite heavy assaults, Soviet forces failed to breach the lines held by the 23rd Panzer Division and the 4th Cavalry Brigade, reinforced by 5 powerful King Tiger tanks from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. Multiple attacks, especially around the Cholkako area, were repelled with heavy Soviet losses. Gorshkov planned to renew the attack the next day with fresh forces. At the same time, Soviet intelligence misread the situation. Zakharov believed the German counterattack aimed at retaking Stuhlweisenberg itself. As a result, he kept his reserve forces, including the 16th Mechanized Brigade and the 41st Guards Rifle Division, positioned in that sector instead of shifting them northward, exactly what the Germans had hoped for. Despite knowing that the 4th SS Panzer Corps had left Warsaw and moved to Hungary, Soviet intelligence had not yet determined its exact location. An intelligence summary from the 4th Guards Army issued on the evening of January 1st showed how successful the German deception had been. It read, quote, "The enemy is striving to hold its present positions with all its forces. On some sectors, the adversary is conducting local attacks to improve their positions. With conditions now favorable, the 4th SS Panzer Corps was ready to launch its real offensive." Elsewhere, General Balk's forces reported further activity. Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps observed Soviet engineers attempting to build a pontoon bridge across the Gran River south of Kiksind, which was disrupted by artillery. A Soviet reconnaissance company was also driven off near Kamar Giamat. On the left flank, the division group von Rintelen reported a minor Soviet river crossing near Garam Mikola, but counterattacks were already underway to restore the position. Inside Budapest, the situation grew more desperate. Reports from the 9th SS Mountain Corps indicated Soviet attacks against both the western and eastern bridgeheads, backed by heavy artillery barrages. In some areas, Soviet forces penetrated deep into German defences, only to be driven back by fierce counterattacks. Supplies dropped by air were insufficient to meet the needs of the defenders, who suffered from shortages of food, fuel, and ammunition. Meanwhile, for the men of the 4th SS Panzer Corps, many still recovering from New Year's Eve celebrations, January 1st was spent moving into final positions. The weather helped. Ground fog, snowfall, and cloud cover masked their movements from Soviet reconnaissance. Temperatures hovered slightly above freezing, keeping the muddy roads passable. Trains continued delivering men, vehicles, and supplies to rail hubs at Raab, Axe, and Komorn. Field cables were laid to connect Corps headquarters with division command posts. Artillery plans were finalized. Ammunition and Nabalwerfer rockets were unpacked and distributed to concealed gun positions. On the north bank of the Danube, the 96th Infantry Division quietly prepared assault boats for a river crossing operation. As night fell, the skies cleared and temperatures plunged to -3 degrees Celsius. A near full moon lit up the frozen landscape. At 8 p.m., slightly delayed, the first phase of Operation Conrad began. Infantry units from the 96th Division attempted to cross the Danube without artillery support. Challenges soon emerged. Many boats were in poor condition, engines struggled to start in the bitter cold, and ice floes on the wide river endangered the assault craft. The first attempt to land at Labatlan failed under heavy fire. However, other groups successfully crossed near Suto and Njergas Ujfalu. After intense house-to-house fighting, German troops overran the defending forces from the 4th Guards Rifle Division, securing critical footholds. By dawn, the German beachheads were firmly established. More troops and heavy weapons were ferried across during the night. As the bridgeheads expanded, German forces began moving into the rear areas of the Soviet 4th and 80th Guards Rifle Divisions. Major Christoph Magali's 284th Grenadier Regiment, delayed by rail transport, was en route to reinforce the bridgeheads from the south bank. The first act of Operation Conrad had begun successfully, but the battles ahead would be even harder. The success of Oberst Harrendorf's river crossing was quickly recorded in the war diary of Army Group South late that night. It read simply, "During the Danube crossing of elements of the 96th Infantry Division, no sounds of fighting were heard." It appears the surprise was complete. General Major Gaedke, Chief of Staff for Army Group Balk, described the feat with an old term, a Kabinettsstück, meaning a masterpiece of military precision. With the diversionary attack by the 1st Panzer Division also achieving its aim, the stage was now fully set for the main event. The armoured spearheads of the Totenkopf and Wiking divisions, along with Division Group Pape, finally poised to unleash their assault. Across the frozen fields, inside their humming tanks and shivering half-tracks, thousands of men sat waiting in the darkness, engines idling, breath misting the air, nerves tight as bowstrings. At 7:30 p.m, the lead elements of the Totenkopf and Wiking divisions crossed their line of departure, marked by the frozen ribbon of the Altala River and Kuhltrieber Creek. On the Corps' left flank, Hauptsturmführer Christian Bachmann's 2nd Battalion of the Totenkopf Regiment made the first move. Wading waist-deep through the icy waters of Kuhltrieber Creek, soaked to the skin, Bachmann's men pushed up the opposite bank without being detected. Using the faint light of a full moon and the soft cover of snowfall, they quickly formed up and pressed their assault forward. The Soviet 217th Rifle Regiment had not expected an attack from this direction. In brutal close-quarters fighting, Bachmann's men overwhelmed their stunned enemies. Bayonets flashed, grenades tore through hastily thrown-up defences, and the Soviets either fled into the hills or fell where they stood. There was no time to celebrate. Bachmann drove his men relentlessly forward toward Hill 294, a snow-covered rise that dominated the approaches to the village of Dunalmas. By midnight, the battered defenders had been driven off. Without waiting for orders, Bachmann's soaked and freezing men stormed into the southern outskirts of Dunalmas itself, catching the rear units of the Soviet 80th Guards Rifle Division completely off guard. Within hours, the village, straddling the vital road to Suto and Nieges Uchvalu, was secured. Bachmann ordered his men to dig in and prepare for Soviet counterattacks, but the real hammer was only now beginning to fall. At 11 p.m, the armoured spearhead of Totenkopf rolled out. 11 King Tigers of the 9th Company, Panzer Regiment 3, led the way, followed closely by the Panthers of Sturmbannführer Erwin Meyer-Dress's 1st Battalion. Their advance was swift. With the Soviet front line in disarray, they linked up with Bachmann's battalion at Dunalmas by midnight and pushed beyond without serious resistance. But fortune soon turned. Less than 2 kilometers past the village, the lead Tiger, tank number 902, was knocked out by a concealed anti-tank gun. Another tank was disabled soon after, throwing a track after a hit. The column ground to a halt. Dismounting under fire, the Panzer Grenadiers swept forward to clear the obstacle, facing a well-organized defensive line of T-34 tanks from the 170th Tank Brigade, Su-85 assault guns, and entrenched Soviet artillery units. The fighting turned savage and bloody in the bitter cold. At the center of the Corps' attack, Kampfgruppe Dor, composed of Panzer Grenadier Regiment Germania and Panzer Group Dargis with the tanks of Panzer Regiment 5, also launched their assault. Since Oberführer Ulrich had not yet arrived to take direct command at the forward post in Tata, Dor assumed leadership in his absence. To clear the highway running east through Agostian, the infantry had first to cross the treacherous Kuhltrieber Creek, slog through minefields in the dark, and storm the outposts of the Soviet 232 Guards Rifle Regiment. Hours of brutal inch-by-inch fighting followed before finally, around 11 p.m, Kampfgruppe Dor launched a general assault. On the right flank, Hauptsturmführer Franz Pleiner led the 2nd Battalion of Germania directly into Baj. Soviet troops, caught celebrating the new year, were completely unprepared. Grenades and automatic fire shattered the revelry. Baj fell quickly. Simultaneously, the 1st and 2nd Battalions hammered into Somod and Agostian. Amid hand-to-hand fighting in narrow streets, Pleiner was seriously wounded, passing command to Sturmbannführer Heinrich Amberg. The battered battalions pressed eastward, capturing Hill 537 and pushing on toward the village of Tolna to protect Dargis's advancing armour. With the Soviet front splintering, Panzer Group Dargis, now joined by the armoured infantry of the 3rd Battalion, began their advance. At the front, Untersturmführer Günther Stelz's Panther from 6th Company led the charge. Near Agostian, Stelz was cut down by a sniper's bullet, the first of many Wiking men who would fall in Hungary. Nevertheless, the armoured thrust did not slow. Agostian fell under their treads and the road to Tarjan lay open. As they rolled forward, soldiers of Kampfgruppe Westland stumbled upon the bodies of fallen Germans and Hungarians along the roadside. Some appeared to have been shot trying to escape Soviet capture, others showed signs of execution. The grisly discovery hardened the resolve of the SS men. They were determined to retake this land and avenge their comrades. Throughout the advance, civilians greeted the German soldiers with cautious hope. Under Soviet occupation, looting, beatings and worse had become commonplace. Now, with the Red Army pushed back, many locals saw the Germans not as conquerors, but as liberators. Meanwhile, Division Group PAP, operating on the right flank, began its own assault at 8:30 p.m. Two armoured battle groups, Kampfgruppe Philipp and Kampfgruppe Knoop, drove forward towards Tatabánya and Banhida. Fighting was fierce but swift. Banhida fell quickly, and the push toward the vital industrial town of Felsugala continued. There, PAP's forces would establish a defensive screen to guard Wiking's exposed flank against the inevitable Soviet counterblow. For the first time in months, after endless retreats and defeats, a full-scale German offensive was underway on the Eastern Front. The 4th Guards Army was caught completely off guard. Soviet headquarters did not realize the scale of the attack until 2:30 a.m., a full 6 hours after it had begun. In their own reports, Soviet commanders admitted that German success was due to overwhelming superiority in men, tanks and artillery, combined with the unready state of their defenses. Against 8,000 scattered defenders supported by fewer than 50 tanks, Gila's corps had unleashed more than 25,000 men, over 320 armoured vehicles, and 57 artillery batteries. It was a crushing blow, and it was only the beginning. General Zakharov, commanding the 4th Guards Army, wasted no time. He rushed a rifle battalion and the 407th Light Artillery Regiment toward Agostian, desperately trying to plug the widening gaps. Combat engineers and anti-tank batteries followed close behind. However, heavier reinforcements, including the 86th Guards Rifle Division and the 12th Separate Anti-Tank Regiment, would take precious hours to arrive. By dawn, on January 2nd, Gila's offensive had built unstoppable momentum. At the bridgehead near Sutto, Oberst Harrendorf's 96th Infantry Division expanded its gains. Artillery from the far bank of the Danube now supported the assault, hammering Soviet positions in Niegas Uchvalu and along the river road. German troops fought building to building, clearing resistance one house at a time. Meanwhile, Totenkopf's armoured spearhead found itself locked in vicious combat near Dunalmus. Sturmbannführer Anton Lachmann's tanks battled through fierce Soviet resistance. 18 Soviet T-34s from the 170th Tank Brigade, supported by assault guns and dug-in anti-tank units, made every metre a killing ground. Calls for artillery support roared over the radios, and at 5 a.m, Sturmbannführer Fritz Messel's batteries unleashed hell on Soviet positions. Inside his command tank, Sturmbannführer Mayadres led from the front. When his lead Panther was knocked out, he ordered his driver to swing past the wreck and personally took the lead with Panther 101. His radio operator, Unterscharführer Zerman, later recalled, "One Tiger after another fell silent. Sturmbannführer Mayadres stood up in the turret and waved us forward. We had not yet fired a shot when suddenly he shouted, 'Halt!' and disappeared into the darkness. For a moment, all we heard was the groan of engines and the clatter of tracks moving forward into the unknown." The battle for Hungary, and for the fate of an entire front, had truly begun. At dawn on January 2nd, the first light revealed the frozen wasteland of Hungary's winter battlefield. Inside Panther 101, radio operator Unterscharführer Zerman glanced at his watch. It was 6:45 a.m. Sturmbannführer Erwin Mayadres, the commander of the 1st Battalion, gave a simple order. "Move out, Sepp!" Just as the column lurched forward, a tremendous explosion rocked the tank. Inside the fighting compartment, the air turned searing hot and blinding red. Zerman fought to crank open his jammed hatch. Alongside him, Sepp Hirsch bailed out, both tumbling into a roadside ditch. Through the smoke, they saw Panther 101 still running, but everyone in the turret was dead. A concealed Soviet Su-85, hidden inside a roadside house, had fired the fatal shot that instantly killed Mayadres, one of Totenkopf's most respected commanders. Word of his death swept through the column like wildfire. The grief of the men turned into rage. A swift hunt began for the Soviet gun. Within minutes, Panther 103, commanded by Unterscharführer Arp, spotted the culprit and destroyed it with a single furious shot. But the battle was far from over. The remaining panzers, along with the panzer grenadiers of Endress's battalion and the armoured cars of the 3rd SS Reconnaissance Battalion, launched a brutal sweep through the houses and woods along the road. Soviet tanks, anti-tank guns and pockets of infantry were hunted down in vicious close-quarters combat. One eyewitness wrote, "The men of Regiment Eike attacked again and again, grim and relentless. Panzerfausts roared. 7 enemy tanks fell to infantry alone." With the last Soviet strongpoint smashed, the armoured column pushed eastward at speed. 3 8-wheeled armoured cars led the way, scattering survivors of the 80th Guards Rifle Division, who fired wildly from the hills with rifles and machine guns, powerless to stop the steel tide surging past them. By 9 AM, the Spearhead linked up with the 96th Infantry Division's troops at Sütow, and without pause, rolled toward Bicske, 10 kilometers from their starting point. Against all odds, the Totenkopf Division had shattered the Soviet defences and was now surging deep behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, to the south, Wiking Division's assault, led by Kampfgruppe Dor, continued hammering forward. The prize was Agostian, a critical communications hub and headquarters of the 80th Guards Rifle Division. The German attack smashed through the hastily organised Soviet defences. According to Soviet Colonel Tishkov, command and control were disrupted, a polite understatement for the chaos his men faced. But Dor had no time to rest. His next objective, Tarian, lay 13 kilometers southeast, hidden beyond the rugged Werta Mountains. The only route was a narrow road, winding through dense forests and steep mountain passes, a natural killing ground for any determined defender. While Wiking and Totenkopf advanced, Division Group Pape ran into trouble. The left battle group bogged down in a dense minefield just 500 meters from Tatabányá's edge, pinned by heavy anti-tank fire. On the right, another battle group stalled against stubborn Soviet resistance. With few infantry available to clear houses or assault gun nests, Division Group Pape's attack ground to a halt. Sandwiched between the Wiking and Totenkopf spearheads, Kampfgruppe Biber, a scratch unit built from the remnants of the 271st Volksgrenadier Division, succeeded where others stumbled. At 4 PM, Biber's men smashed eastwards, clearing Shomore by nightfall after fierce street fighting. Yet the struggle of Division Group Pape was a grim warning. Unternehmen Conrad would be no easy thrust. The dense mountains, harsh winter terrain, and bitter Soviet resistance would bleed time and men before Budapest could be reached. Obergruppenführer Giller, commanding from a forward headquarters 5 kilometers west of Tata, knew action was needed. Communications were failing, radios were unreliable in the mountains, and couriers struggled through ice, mud, and wrecked roads, often delayed for 6 to 12 hours. After consultation with General Balk, Giller ordered Division Group Pape's battle groups to disengage and pull north to Tata. There they would join Wiking's advance and later strike southwest to outflank Tatabánya from the rear. To bolster Giller's attack, Balk authorized the transfer of the 6th Panzer Division, fresh reinforcements that would soon swing the balance once more. Back on the battlefield, Totenkopf pressed forward. East of Labatlan, they clashed with a Soviet blocking force, 16 T-34 tanks entrenched to block the road. In a ferocious tank battle, the 4 remaining King Tigers and Panthers from the 1st Battalion of Panzer Regiment 3 tore into the enemy. Soviet armour burned across the snowy fields. Not a single German tank was lost. By noon, Totenkopf's Spearhead linked up with the bridgehead forces of the 96th Infantry Division at Nyerges Uchvalu, whose 287th Grenadier Regiment had suffered 139 casualties seizing the town and nearby hill 200. From there, the division split. One group turned south towards Bayot, while the main column pressed along the river road. By evening, Bayot fell after a brutal assault led by Hauptsturmführer Heinz Müller's 3rd Battalion and Osthoff, Gerhard Wenke's Panthers. An eyewitness recalled, "The village was burning all around us. Wrecked Soviet tanks, shattered guns, and smashed trucks littered the crossroads." One radio operator, Panzerfunker Edelmann, riding in Panzer 501, remembered, "As we pushed through Bayot, it felt like the old days. Guns blazing, treads crushing the wreckage beneath us. We fought our way forward without hesitation." Beyond Bayot, a small reconnaissance team under Unterscharführer Marienfeld moved toward Bina. Local civilians warned them the Soviets had fled hours earlier, but reality proved different. As night fell, a lone T-34 rumbled past their hiding place. Marienfeld chose caution, holding position in the darkness. Earlier, they had captured a Soviet jeep, astonishingly driven straight into their column by confused enemy soldiers. Such were the chaotic, shifting lines of this bitter winter battle. Meanwhile, Totenkopf's main spearhead reached the crossroads at Tath. There, reconnaissance forces led the division southeast, directly into a fortified Soviet defensive line near the Tokhod sugar factory. Heavy anti-tank fire pinned them down. Soviet troops from the 4th Guards Rifle Division, dug into the fields and forests, stubbornly held their ground. The German advance paused for the night, artillery duels raging in the frozen night air. Despite fierce resistance, the first full day of Unternehmen, Conrad had gone well for Totenkopf. The division had met all its objectives. The daring river crossing by the 96th Infantry Division, the brutal armoured push of Totenkopf, and the relentless pressure from Wiking had cracked the Soviet defences wide open. But the road to Budapest, through frozen forests, treacherous valleys and savage rearguard actions, would demand even greater sacrifices in the days ahead. While Totenkopf's spearhead hammered its way forward along the river road, the situation for the Wiking division under Oberführer Ulrich remained far more difficult. On January 2nd, all Ulrich had at his disposal was Kampfgruppe Dor, 3 Panzergrenadier battalions, 2 half-strength tank battalions, and a single self-propelled artillery battalion. It was a sharp contrast to the full panzer force Totenkopf had hurled into battle. On Ulrich's left, Kampfgruppe Bieber, reinforced with a tank battalion, had seized Shomore after heavy fighting. But on his exposed right flank, Division Group Pape's 2 armoured battle groups had made only limited progress. It was a vulnerability the Soviets would soon try to exploit. After the success at Agostian, Kampfgruppe Dor, led by Obersturmführer Karl-Heinz Lichter and his 5th Company, prepared to push deeper into the forests toward Tarian. Late in the afternoon, under a steel-grey sky, Lichter's tanks moved cautiously down the narrow forest road. Engineers, rifles slung across their backs, worked furiously ahead of the column, clearing mines under threat of sniper and artillery fire. Barely 2 kilometers into their advance, the Germans walked straight into a Soviet trap. A wall of hidden anti-tank guns from the 1000th Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment opened fire from concealed positions in the woods east of Agostian. The ambush was devastating. 1 Panther was immediately knocked out. Hemmed in by dense woods on either side, unable to deploy his tanks into firing formation, Lichter urgently called for help. The Panzer Grenadiers of the 3rd Battalion, Germania Regiment, dismounted from their half-tracks and stormed into the woods under covering fire, flanking and eliminating the Soviet gun positions in brutal close-quarters fighting. Yet even as they cleared one obstacle, another arose. From the steep hillsides, Soviet infantry of the 80th Guards Rifle Division launched savage attacks, pinning down the column and slowing the advance to a crawl. What began as a straightforward thrust had turned into a grinding, exhausting brawl. This became the defining pattern of Wiking's battle in the Werther Mountains: advance, ambush, dismount, fight through, remount, and move again. Each time they pushed forward, they left security elements behind to protect the supply routes from Soviet stay-behind units. These groups, sometimes as small as a rifle platoon, sometimes whole battalions, were not content to hide. They counterattacked aggressively, striking at the German columns with sudden violence. Artillery support, critical for the assault's success, had become all but ineffective. Dense woods, steep terrain, and poor communications crippled the efforts of Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Bülow's 2nd Battalion of SS Panzer Artillery Regiment 5. Requests for fire missions were delayed or never arrived. Unlike the Americans or British, the Germans had no light aircraft available to spot for the gunners. Artillery would only become effective once Dor's troops fought free of the forests and reached open ground beyond Tarjan. By nightfall on January 2nd, after more than 24 hours of fighting, Wiking's armoured spearhead had crawled 6 kilometers southeast of Agostian. They halted within sight of Tolna, exhausted and bloodied. Complicating matters, Soviet troops had managed to reoccupy Barge, a village that lay across Wiking's main supply route. Ulrich, newly arrived on the battlefield, immediately dispatched the division's engineer battalion under Hauptsturmführer Eberhard Hader. With grim efficiency, Hader's men cleared the village of Soviet troops and reopened the vital road. That evening, 4th SS Panzer Corps summarized the day's operations in its daily report to Army Group Balk and the 6th Army. The report read, "After overcoming strong enemy resistance, our forces attacking through Agostian pushed the enemy back to Tolna. The mopping up of Soviet elements around Somod is still underway. Despite obstacles, our troops widened and united the Danube bridgeheads. The river road has been cleared to Nyerges Ujfalu. Several Soviet counterattacks against that town were repelled. Fighting for Bajot continues against stiff enemy resistance." Privately, Gila's mood was less optimistic. In his diary, he expressed frustration that Division Group Pape had failed to meet its objectives, forcing Wiking to divert precious strength to cover its right flank. Meanwhile, the first trains carrying the 711th Infantry Division had begun to arrive on January 2nd. However, it would take 2 more days before Generalleutnant Reichert's division could assemble and move into the Gorecki Mountains. Their task would be grim, hunting down the scattered Soviet units left behind by Totenkopf's armoured breakthrough. Elsewhere, reports from Corps Group Breith painted a mixed picture. In their sector, attacks against Alsogala, part of the Tatabanya area, had bogged down against strong Soviet resistance and heavy anti-tank barriers. The diversionary attack by the 1st Panzer Division, which might have tied down even more Soviet reserves, had not been continued, a missed opportunity. On the northern bank of the Danube, the situation remained stable. Encouraged by this, Balk's headquarters authorized the withdrawal of the 6th Panzer Division from Elfi Yaz Panzer Corps to reinforce Gila's offensive. In Budapest itself, the battle raged on. The 9th SS Mountain Corps reported bitter fighting in the northeast sector. During the night, 2 Soviet T-34 tanks were destroyed with close combat weapons. Despite relentless Soviet air attacks, waves of IL-2 Sturmovix, Boston bombers and Lag-3 fighters, the garrison held firm. That day, 19 Ju-52 transport planes managed to land, evacuating 268 wounded soldiers and delivering 73 tons of ammunition and precious fuel, but supplies remained critically low. Elsewhere, a daring supply ship attempting to run the Danube was stranded behind enemy lines. Its crew frantically unloaded supplies into smaller boats under fire. Only a fraction of the shipment made it to the trapped garrison. At Army Group South headquarters, General Balk's evening intelligence summary reflected both progress and looming danger. "Our offensive south of the Danube is gaining ground. The enemy has committed elements of the 31st Guards Rifle Corps and the 18th Tank Corps to resist us. We expect counterattacks from local reserves and possibly the 6th Guards Tank Army, which remains east of the Grand River, poised for deployment." German intelligence feared that once reconstituted, the powerful 6th Guards Tank Army could be unleashed against the German spearheads sooner than anticipated, a grim prospect as the armoured units of Wiking and Totenkopf pressed deeper into hostile territory, and the Soviets were already reacting. During the night of January 2nd, Soviet commanders ordered the battered but still dangerous 110th and 181st Tank Brigades forward. Together, they could field over 80 T-34 tanks. Alongside them, the heavy guns of the 363rd Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment moved into position. Their orders were clear: block the German thrust toward Bajna, Tokod, and ultimately Budapest itself. The clock was ticking. The Germans had won the opening battles of Operation Conrad. But the true test, a brutal armoured clash across the frozen fields and forested hills of Hungary, was about to begin. As the sun set over the frozen Hungarian forests on January 2nd, the situation for Oberfuhrer Ulrich's Wiking division grew increasingly precarious. All Ulrich had at his disposal was Kampfgruppe Dor, just 3 Panzergrenadier battalions, 2 understrength tank battalions, and a single self-propelled artillery battalion, far less than the heavy armoured thrust Totenkopf had unleashed. On Ulrich's left, Kampfgruppe Bieber, reinforced with tanks, had seized Shomore after heavy fighting. But on the right, Division Group Pape's 2 battle groups had barely advanced, leaving Wiking's flank dangerously exposed, ripe for a Soviet counterattack. In the late afternoon, after initial successes at Agostian, Kampfgruppe Dor's armoured spearhead, led by Obersturmführer Karl-Heinz Lichter and his 5th Company, pushed cautiously down the narrow forest roads toward Tarjan. Every few meters, engineers had to dismount. braving sniper fire to clear anti-tank mines scattered across the path. 2 kilometers into the advance, disaster struck. A wall of hidden anti-tank guns, Soviet 76mm pieces from the 1,000th Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment, opened fire from camouflaged positions among the trees east of Agostian. A Panther was hit and knocked out. Pinned on the narrow road, unable to maneuver his tanks into battle formation, Lichter urgently called for help. The Panzer Grenadiers of the 3rd Battalion, Germania Regiment, dismounted from their half-tracks and stormed into the woods under withering fire. Hand grenades exploded among the trees. Soviet gun crews fought savagely, but the Germans overwhelmed the line in brutal close-quarters combat. Yet even as they cleared the gun line, a fresh danger arose. From the steep hillsides above, Soviet infantry from the 80th Guards Rifle Division launched a sudden assault. Grenades and rifle fire rained down. The advance slowed to a bloody crawl. This was now the grim pattern of Waking's battle through the Vertes Mountains. Advance, ambush, dismount, outflank, clear the roadblock, then remount and move again. With every push forward, security detachments had to be left behind to guard the supply line, thinning the lead units even further, and the Soviets adapted. Groups of Red Army soldiers, bypassed in the initial breakthrough, didn't simply sit and wait. Instead, they launched aggressive raids on the German rear, forcing Wiking's troops to constantly defend themselves and launch their own counterattacks just to keep the roads open. It was becoming an exhausting, costly, and time-consuming war of attrition. Worse still, artillery support, so crucial for suppressing Soviet strongpoints, became almost useless. The dense woods and rugged hills made it nearly impossible for Sturmbannführer Karl-Heinz Bülow's artillery battalion to target the enemy accurately. No spotting planes circled overhead, unlike the Americans or British, and radio transmissions often failed completely, trapped in the folds of the mountainous terrain. It was only once Kampfgruppe Dor broke free of the forested slopes that artillery could again play a meaningful role. Yet in his private diary, Obergruppenführer Giller was far less upbeat. He complained bitterly that Division Group Pape's failure to advance threatened the entire southern flank, forcing the overstretched Wiking Division to divert precious strength. Meanwhile, the first trains carrying the 711th Infantry Division had begun to arrive, but it would take 2 more days before General-Lieutenant Reichert could assemble his division and send it into the Gorecha Mountains, where they would hunt down the Soviet troops left behind during Totenkopf's furious advance. On Giller's right flank, Corps Group Brythe's report painted a grim picture. Against tough enemy resistance and strong anti-tank barriers, our attack on the Tatabánya area was halted. One cannot help but wonder, if the 1st Panzer Division had continued its diversionary attack that day, would the 4th Guards Army have been forced to hold more forces back, easing Giller's burden? To the north, the situation on the far bank of the Danube remained stable, leading Balck's headquarters to authorize the withdrawal of the 6th Panzer Division to reinforce the offensive, but ominous signs were building. In Budapest, the 9th SS Mountain Corps reported heavy fighting overnight. In the northeastern sector, 2 Soviet T-34 tanks were destroyed by infantry armed with close combat weapons. Elsewhere, relentless Soviet airstrikes battered the front lines and city center. Waves of IL-2 Sturmovix, Boston bombers and LaGG-3 fighters, often escorted by Yak-9s, struck in groups as large as 15. That same day, 19 Junkers Ju-52s managed to land in Budapest, evacuating 268 wounded soldiers and bringing in precious ammunition and fuel, but it barely covered the daily needs. Meanwhile, a supply ship from Komarum ran aground behind enemy lines. Its desperate crew began frantically unloading supplies into smaller boats under constant threat of capture. Only part of the cargo made it through. At Army Group South's headquarters, General Balck's evening report summarized the larger picture. South of the Danube, our offensive is slowly gaining ground. Soviet resistance stiffens, committing elements of the 31st Guards Rifle Corps and the 18th Tank Corps. We anticipate that local reserves will be committed to blunt our attack. Balck's intelligence officers were deeply worried about a hidden danger lurking in the east, the 6th Guards Tank Army. Still resting and rebuilding behind the Soviet lines east of the Gran River, the powerful tank army had not yet moved, but Hauptmann von Pander warned, once its reconstitution ends, we must expect it to be deployed rapidly, either to halt our offensive or to resume the Soviet advance westward. The gamble of pulling the 6th Panzer Division away from the north might soon backfire. Meanwhile, in Soviet headquarters, confusion reigned. Reports from the front were conflicting. Communications with several units had been lost. Was this a local German attack, or a full-scale offensive? No one knew for certain, but the Red Army was already reacting. Orders were issued to the battered but still dangerous 110th and 181st Tank Brigades and the heavy assault guns of the 363rd Regiment. Together, they mustered 80 operational T-34 tanks and 19 Su-122 self-propelled guns. These units were rushed forward to block the roads to Baina and to Kod, exactly where Totenkopf was now striking. Simultaneously, the 12th Guards Cavalry Division, the tip of Gorshkov's 5th Guards Cavalry Corps, began moving northeast toward Felsegala. Incredibly, the Soviets' defensive redeployments put them squarely between Wiking and Totenkopf's objectives at Bicske and Jambek. They could not have been better placed even if General Zakharov had known the German plan in advance, but German intelligence at Army Group South had missed their exact location. For now, they remained hidden, but not for long. The battle for Hungary was about to ignite into a brutal collision of steel and fire, and for the exhausted men of Totenkopf and Wiking, the hardest days still lay ahead. By the dawn of January 3rd, the Soviet regiment defending Tarian, hastily moved from Pushtavam, had barely dug in before Wiking's spearhead smashed into them. By 3 p.m., most of Tarian had fallen. Dor's Kampfgruppe pushed even further by 4:30 p.m., reaching 5 kilometers southeast of Tarjan, despite Soviet aircraft harassing the column all day. Anti-aircraft fire kept losses minimal, and by evening, the Wiking Division's forward headquarters shifted to Tarjan. Help was also on the way. SS Sturmbannführer Braun arrived to take over as division operations officer, and reinforcements, including elements of the Westland Regiment and Fritz Vogt's Norge Battalion, detrained at Komarum and Rab. Division Group Pape's armoured Kampfgruppen followed Wiking's advance but faced stiff resistance near Tatabanya. Kampfgruppe Philipp shot up a Soviet supply column but was halted at a mountain pass. Although the Soviets risked encirclement, they refused to abandon the town. Meanwhile, the 6th Panzer Division began shifting south to reinforce the 4th SS Panzer Corps. Its first task, clearing Soviet stragglers ambushing Wiking's supply lines. Oberst Jürgens established his new command post at Hereg, protecting Wiking's vulnerable flank. On the same day, General Wöhler visited the front to investigate the slow progress firsthand. After touring the muddy, mountainous battlefield, he left with a far better appreciation of the brutal conditions Giller's men faced. Wöhler later wrote that the corps and divisions were doing all they could, despite the grueling terrain and tough Soviet defences. That evening's report noted that Tarian and Hereg were taken, but fighting raged east of Bajna. Soviet armour that had briefly broken into Bajna and Nagisap was pushed back. Meanwhile, air battles intensified. Soviet aircraft flew 300 sorties, strafing German columns in the open. Luftflotte Wehr, overstretched, shot down 35 enemy planes but could spare little to directly support the ground attack. At Tatabanya, Division Group Pape's tanks stalled. Breith's Corps Group reported similar problems attacking Alsogala. Even minor Soviet bridgeheads north of the Danube continued causing headaches, especially near the Gran River. Inside Budapest itself, the siege momentarily eased. Soviet attacks lessened as Red Army reserves were rushed westward to block the German offensive. Still, the 5th Soviet Air Army hammered the city from the air, while the Luftwaffe's Ju-52s and He-111s fought to resupply the desperate garrison. German reconnaissance spotted large Soviet troop movements away from Budapest, but where exactly they would strike next remained unclear. The battle was entering a critical phase. Giller's men had punched through the outer defences, but tougher Soviet counterattacks were gathering beyond the hills. By January 3rd, the Soviet forces regrouping between Mor and Banhida were preparing for fresh attacks westward. German intelligence noted possible movements of Soviet mechanized forces toward the Vertis Mountains, while enemy forces north of the Danube were repositioning closer to the Gran River. Despite fierce resistance, German commanders remained optimistic about the progress of their offensive. At 10:10 p.m., Generals Wöhler and Balck spoke by field telephone. Balck expressed satisfaction with the day's gains, explaining that his panzer divisions had adapted to the mountainous terrain and were now driving hard toward Bicske and Jambek. Orders were issued for non-stop pressure to maintain momentum. That night, troops braced for another freezing day. Food supplies froze before reaching the front, and vehicles lacked heating. Soldiers bundled up in layers, but the cold bit hard. Despite the brutal conditions, the offensive rolled on. Early on January 4th, the 96th Infantry Division launched renewed attacks under orders from General Wöhler, pushing past Urachtana and seizing Tath after heavy fighting. Lorenz's regiment captured Soviet guns and trucks but hit stiff resistance near Dorog, facing enemy T-34s and Stalin tanks. Lacking armor support, they dug in to await reinforcements. Meanwhile, the 711th Infantry Division cleared 10 kilometers of forest, moving into position to support the 96th. Oberst Harrendorf's grenadiers struggled to keep pace with Totenkopf's fast-moving panzers while fighting off Soviet counterattacks and artillery barrages. Further south, Totenkopf's advance intensified. Under cover of a snowstorm, Panzer Grenadiers destroyed Soviet tanks in close combat near Baina, forcing enemy armor to retreat. The main effort shifted towards seizing Shomore. At dawn, Becker's Panzergruppe smashed through Soviet defenses, their tanks sliding across icy roads, dismounting troops whenever Soviet ambushes blocked the way. Though several Soviet tank traps were cleared, the advance was finally halted near Hill 184 by a powerful anti-tank belt. Undeterred, Lachmann ordered his Panthers and Tigers off the main road, bypassing the defences by advancing cross-country in classic spearhead formation. Shomore lay just ahead, and with it, the path toward Budapest's relief. As Unternehmen, Conrad entered its fourth day. German intelligence noted Soviet regrouping near Moor and Banhida, suggesting a coming counterattack. Despite Soviet forces concentrating southwest of Gran and near Bicske, progress by the Wiking and Totenkopf divisions was steady. Balck and Wöhler, speaking by field telephone that evening, agreed that the Panzer divisions were finally mastering armoured fighting in the mountainous terrain. Orders were issued to press the attack. Wiking toward Bicske, Totenkopf toward Jambek, and the 96th Infantry Division to advance east along the Danube. Despite freezing conditions, German forces pushed forward on 4th January. Soldiers endured bitter cold, sleeping outdoors without fires, and vehicle crews battled frostbite in unheated tanks and trucks. Still, the attack rolled on. The 96th Infantry Division, after stern rebukes from higher command, attacked before dawn. Lorenz's regiment fought fiercely, capturing Tath after hours of combat, seizing Soviet guns and trucks. Progress was slower near Dorog, where Soviet T-34s and Stalin tanks halted further advance until reinforcements could arrive. Meanwhile, the 711th Infantry Division cleared enemy resistance in the Goreksi Mountains and advanced to support the push on Gran. Oberst Harrendorf's troops struggled to match the speed of the advancing Totenkopf division, fighting through Soviet artillery and counterattacks. To coordinate better, both divisions moved their headquarters close together at Nerges Ushvalu. Totenkopf faced brutal combat south of Badna. Using the cover of a snowstorm, Panzer Grenadiers destroyed several Soviet tanks in close combat, forcing Soviet armour to retreat south. The division then shifted its focus to the town of Shomore. Before dawn, the Panzergruppe attacked, clearing Soviet defences with Panzerfausts and hand grenades. Tanks skidded across icy roads under heavy fire, smashing through ambushes as they advanced. However, at Hill 184, a strong Soviet anti-tank barrier halted the direct approach. Ostubaf, Lachmann ordered his tanks to bypass the defences cross-country, forming up in Panzerkeil formation and pressing onward towards Shomore and ultimately Jambek and the road to Budapest. On 5th January, the 96th Infantry Division launched a hard assault under freezing conditions. Grenadier Regiment 283 quickly seized Tokod's key buildings and pressed towards Hill 457, but assaults by Regiments 284 and 287 towards Dorog stalled with heavy losses against dug-in Soviet tanks. Without armour support, progress was limited. Meanwhile, the Totenkopf division focused on capturing Shomore, facing fierce Soviet defences. The Eike Regiment fought street by street against entrenched Soviet tanks and infantry, suffering heavy losses. After brutal house-to-house combat, Totenkopf finally secured the town, only to repel an immediate Soviet counterattack from the 5th Guards Mechanized Brigade. Despite the victory, an attempt to advance towards Jambek was halted by concealed Soviet tanks south of Shomore, during which Totenkopf's panzer commander Lachmann was badly wounded. For Wiking Division, the day centered on the fierce battle for the Hegyekasteli estate atop Hill 214. Fighting through Soviet chessboard anti-tank defences around Chabdi and Mani, Wiking's Panzergruppe Darjes broke through early defences and crossed the key Bicske-Jambek road, but at a heavy cost. On their flanks, German and Hungarian forces fended off Soviet counterattacks, protecting the advance. By nightfall, both Totenkopf and Wiking were battered but had advanced, yet it was clear the offensive had reached its climax. Losses in men, tanks, and strength meant that Operation Conrad could not push much further without reinforcement. On 5th January, dense fog helped Panzergruppe Darjes ambush a Soviet convoy near Bicske, capturing 15 trucks and guns. But when a platoon scouted towards Bicske, the fog lifted, exposing them to a deadly Soviet pack front, costing 2 Panthers. Darjes pulled back to the fortified Hegyekasteli estate on Hill 214, turning it into a hedgehog defence with his 18 tanks, SPWs, and Vogt's infantry from the Norge battalion. Soon after, Soviet tanks attacked but were repulsed, and Darjes was ordered to hold the position at all costs. The Hegyekasteli became the stage for a brutal week-long siege. German grenadiers and panthers fended off constant Soviet assaults, airstrikes, and artillery. Fighting often devolved into vicious hand-to-hand combat at the estate's walls. Despite shortages and growing losses, Darjes's force stubbornly held until 12th January, earning the estate the nickname Fort of the Unbreakables. Elsewhere, Wiking's Germania and Westland regiments made little progress as Soviet forces flooded the Bicske-Jambek line with tanks, artillery, and anti-tank guns. Losses mounted, and by evening the offensive ground to a halt. As Corps Commander Giller later noted, although Wiking reached its initial line, Soviet resistance had become too strong, and 5th January marked the climax and the beginning of the end of Operation Conrad's first phase. The 6th Panzer Division, newly placed under the 4th SS Panzer Corps, finally swung into action with 28 tanks and 10 Panthers. It helped retake Hill 300 after a Soviet attack, but Felsogala remained in Soviet hands. Kampfgruppe Philipp, supported by the Westland Regiment, captured Tukros and pushed towards Chabdi, knocking out 5 Soviet tanks. However, Tatabánya and Felsogala continued to block a direct path to Budapest. Despite localized successes, Soviet reinforcements from mechanized and rifle corps began flooding into the battle area, including parts of the 6th Guards Tank Army north of the Danube. Meanwhile, fighting inside Budapest remained fierce, with supply drops interrupted by bad weather and thousands of wounded awaiting evacuation. Signs of a Soviet buildup north of the Grand River raised alarms for German high command. Between 1st to 5th January, German forces claimed 191 Soviet tanks and 624 guns destroyed, but Budapest remained 21 kilometers away, a distance that time and Soviet reinforcements were making increasingly unreachable. General Guderian visited Army Group South and criticized the lack of aggressive exploitation after the initial breakthrough, lamenting the declining quality of German forces compared to 1940. Realizing that the window to relieve Budapest was closing, German commanders decided that Phase 2 of Operation Conrad, restoring the Margaret-Stelling defensive line, would begin immediately on 7th January. Hermann Breit's 3rd Panzer Corps, with the 1st and 23rd Panzer Divisions and the 4th Cavalry Brigade, would lead the renewed offensive. On 5th January, the 6th Panzer Division, now under 4th SS Panzer Corps, finally entered action with 28 tanks and 10 Panthers, though Tatabánya and Felsogala remained in Soviet hands. Kampfgruppe Philipp captured Tukros and advanced toward Chabdi, but Soviet resistance remained fierce across the front. Meanwhile, limited action was reported elsewhere, except in Budapest, where worsening supplies and heavy air attacks deepened the crisis. The Soviet response to Operation Conrad intensified, with several mechanized corps and rifle divisions entering the fight. German intelligence warned of a growing threat north of the Danube, where the 6th Guards Tank Army was preparing an offensive. Although the Germans had inflicted heavy losses, claiming 191 Soviet tanks and hundreds of guns destroyed, Budapest remained 21 kilometers away, and time was running out. General Guderian visited Army Group South and criticized the failure to exploit early successes, blaming a lack of boldness and the declining quality of leadership compared to 1940. He pressed for a quicker end to the Budapest operation so panzer divisions could reinforce critical sectors elsewhere on the Eastern Front. That evening, German commanders agreed to launch Phase 2 of Conrad, the attack to restore the Margaret, without waiting for Bicske or Zambek to fall. General Bryth's 3rd Panzer Corps, reinforced with 46 Panthers, would spearhead the new push starting on 7th January. On the right flank of the Wiking division, the 6th Panzer Division, now reinforced with 28 tanks, tank destroyers and 10 Panthers from I Panzer Regiment 26, finally swung into action on 5th January. That day, both it and Division Group Pape were formally transferred under the 4th SS Panzer Corps, a move that should have been made earlier for better coordination. Meanwhile, Kampfgruppe Biber was reassigned to 3rd Panzer Corps, now reorganized with German and Hungarian infantry battalions. Early that morning, Major Biermann's battalion atop Hill 300 near Felsogala was attacked by Soviet forces, initially thrown back but soon counter-attacking and retaking the position. Nevertheless, Felsogala remained firmly in Soviet hands. Kampfgruppe Philipp, with about 40 armoured vehicles, advanced toward Chabdi, capturing Tukros and destroying 5 Soviet tanks, but the broader goal of opening a fast route to Budapest remained blocked. In its nightly report, 4th SS Panzer Corps summarized that tough enemy resistance persisted throughout the Vertes Mountains, though local gains had been made at Chabdi, Sarisap and north of Shomore. Elsewhere, fighting was minimal. 57th Panzer Corps and Korpsgruppe Bryth reported little activity, though Hungarian forces observed heavy Soviet traffic moving east along Lake Balaton, clear evidence of new Soviet reinforcements. In Budapest itself, the situation was grim. Heavy air raids, artillery fire, minimal airdrops due to bad weather, and an increasing shortage of ammunition and medical supplies. The 6th Army's intelligence section was increasingly alarmed. Soviet mechanized and cavalry corps, backed by 6 to 8 rifle divisions, were resisting fiercely, and fresh Soviet forces including the V-Tank Corps were expected imminently. North of the Danube, Soviet regrouping hinted at a possible new offensive by the 6th Guards Tank Army, either westward or south across the Danube, a growing threat to the German northern flank. Although the Germans had inflicted significant damage, including the destruction of 191 Soviet tanks and assault guns, 624 artillery pieces and 565 prisoners, the relief of Budapest remained far out of reach. The original plan had estimated that the city would be reached by now, but the Germans were still 21 kilometers away, and the window for success was closing fast. That afternoon, General Heinz Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, arrived to review the situation. Visiting Wöhler at Army Group South headquarters, he criticized the lack of bold exploitation after the initial January 1st breakthrough, arguing that had the Wehrmacht still possessed the quality of leaders and troops it had in 1940, Operation Conrad might have succeeded. Guderian emphasized the need to wrap up the Budapest battle quickly, to redeploy precious panzer divisions to Poland, where he expected a massive Soviet offensive at the Baranow bridgehead. That evening, Guderian, Wöhler and Balk met with their staffs and agreed it was time to shift to Phase 2 of Operation Conrad, the restoration of the Margaret defensive line. Without waiting for Giller's divisions to capture Bicske or Jambek, the second phase would commence on 7th of January, spearheaded by General Hermann Bryth's 3rd Panzer Corps. He would use the 1st and 23rd Panzer Divisions and the 4th Cavalry Brigade, reinforced by 46 Panthers left behind by the withdrawing Panzer Lehr Regiment. The clock was ticking. With Soviet forces reinforcing rapidly and Budapest's situation worsening, the Germans knew they had only days left to salvage the operation. And so Operation Conrad I comes to a close, a desperate, savage push through the cold Hungarian plains, where elite divisions like SS Totenkopf and Wiking clawed their way toward Budapest against overwhelming odds. They had broken through Soviet lines, reached within striking distance of the city, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in the chaos. But it wasn't enough. The encirclement still held. The city remained surrounded, and yet the Germans weren't done. Despite 5 long years of war, despite dwindling men, fuel and ammunition, Berlin ordered another assault. Operation Conrad II would launch just days later, and it would be even more brutal. A second offensive followed by a third. 3 massive operations back to back, with blood flowing across the Danube and snow-covered hills turning black with fire. What kind of army in 1945, collapsing on every front, could still muster the will for this kind of fight? What kind of desperation or madness drove men to throw themselves again and again into the flames? We'll soon cover those next battles, because the road to Budapest was not yet finished. The fighting, the sacrifices, the hopeless bravery, it only gets more intense. Stay tuned. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.